Hey everyone, this is Miss Moriarty and I'm here to discuss with us topic 5.5, which is all about irrigation methods. So remember, in our discussions on the Green Revolution, we know that agricultural practices have drastically changed as a result to try and mass produce a lot of food to feed the human population. We know a part of that is using things like pesticides, so we've now discussed pest control methods and more sustainable methods to control those pests. The next piece we're going to talk about are irrigation methods. But before we can get into the specifics of irrigation methods, we do need to understand how do humans on Earth use water. Well, when we look at the distribution of water on Earth, we can see that obviously 3/4 of Earth is covered by water, but a lot of that water is in the form of ocean water, salt water, right? About 97% or so, leaving about 3% of that as fresh water. But when we break down that percentage of fresh water, we can then see that a lot of it's actually trapped within glaciers, right? Within sea ice. And so really only about less than 1% or so of water found on Earth is accessible for human use. So some other aspects we need to understand before we can get to irrigation methods are, what do we use that water for? So we use it to water our crops, but we can also use it for drinking water purposes. This kind of goes a little bit back to Unit 4 and talking about watersheds and how we know that in an area of land, right, all of the water is going to drain into one body of water, and a part of that water can wind up permeating through the rock. When it permeates through the rock, it creates what's called an aquifer. So this would be a permeable layer of rock and sediment that's going to contain that groundwater. Now there's two types of aquifers we can obtain water from. One is called an unconfined aquifer, so that's the one that you see in this picture right here. This is one that's made of very porous rock, so it allows for a lot of permeation, right? So lots of very easy water flow there, versus a confined aquifer here. This is one that's going to be surrounded by an impermeable layer of rock or clay that's going to impede any water flow. But where it's going to recharge is going to be here. So through infiltration, percolation is how water can gather into a confined aquifer. So it's important to note that unconfined aquifers can be rapidly recharged because they're much closer to the surface of land, versus confined aquifers are capped by that impermeable layer of rock, so it takes a lot more time for those to then recharge their water. And that's actually a part of the reason why when we use like well water, for example, we can tap into a confined aquifer source and kind of use the water pressure that builds to then have that water flow up our well there. A very famous aquifer, it's actually the largest aquifer in the world, the Ogallala Aquifer, located in the western part of the United States, can also be called the High Plains Aquifer, covers about a surface area of 450,000 kilometers squared, and it's a part of the reason why the western part of America here is high in agricultural production. All of that available water allows farmers to use it for irrigation purposes. But the problems that we've now seen with the Ogallala Aquifer is that it is being rapidly depleted due to agricultural purposes. So it's not able to recharge at the rate at which we are using it. So some other vocab terms we need to know that are associated with water use in aquifers. That would be the water table. So that's going to be the uppermost level of water in a given area that's going to be fully saturated. Groundwater recharge, that's also going back to like Unit 1, Unit 4, right? This is where we see the water percolate through soil and gather into either our confined or unconfined aquifer. So when we obtain water from the water table, from the aquifer, two things can take place. So when we take up water faster than it can recharge, it can create what's called a cone of depression. So that's going to create a well here that's usually going to make the soil structure very weak, and as a result, sometimes we can even see sinkholes form due to cones of depression. It also makes it much harder for other areas, right, surrounding that cone of depression to have a working well, right? Notice how this house here actually has a dry well because now that cone of depression, that water table is far lower than what their well can reach. What about when you live along the coast and you use the aquifers there? What can happen is a saltwater intrusion. So this will be an infiltration of the saltwater due to being on the coast that winds up in your drinking water. And this is obviously something that we do not want, right? We don't want to be drinking the ocean water. And so this is something that coastal communities really have to take into account when they obtain water from aquifers. Okay, so how do we use then water as a human population? Majority of the time we use it for agricultural purposes. Municipalities can use it like our households for showers, for washing your clothes, or even industries can use it as well. So because about 78% of our water use is used for agricultural purposes, we need to understand how do we use it in agriculture. So there are 4 types of irrigation methods we need to be familiar with. Some are more efficient than others. Some may be more economically viable than others. First one is called a furrow irrigation type. This is where farmers can dig a trench that is then flooded with water nearby their crops. Versus flood irrigation is just as it sounds. The field is actually going to be flooded with water. We can have spray irrigation, which is usually involves some sort of instruments or apparatus that's going to spray water across a field, versus drip irrigation. This is usually a series of pipes or hoses that are either laid on the crops or maybe beneath the crops that are going to slowly drip water directly onto the crop. And so what are some consequences of irrigating the soil? We can see cases of waterlogging. So if we use things like furrow or flood irrigation, that can create soil degradation because now our soil remains underwater for very long periods of time. We can also see what's known as salinization of the soil. So when we use groundwater, that's going to contain lots of minerals and ions and salts. And so when we flood our fields, eventually what happens is that water evaporates, and what's left behind are a lot of the minerals and ions. And so those then accumulate within our soil, create a high salinity, and it reduces the amount of water our plants can actually take in. So why use any of these methods? So looking at flood versus furrow, flood irrigation is obviously a lot easier to implement, right? You're just flooding the field with water. However, it can waterlog the soil or drown the plants, so you want to make sure that you're only doing this for plants that could withstand a long time frame being underwater. It's about 80% efficient or so to about 20% runoff and evaporation. Versus furrow irrigation, this is where we dig trenches in between our crops. That's then once again filled with water. It is an easy method. It's typically pretty inexpensive, right? You have a less chance of waterlogging your crops this way. But we tend to see a lot of water being lost to runoff or evaporation. Here next we have our spray versus drip irrigation. Our ground or surface water is usually obtained through a spray or a nozzle. Usually there's lots of computer programming involved in spray irrigation as well. It's usually very efficient. We have a lot of less water loss, right, because we're not flooding the field. But it can be a little expensive because you are purchasing equipment and so on. Drip irrigation would be your most efficient when it comes to water loss, but it's the most costly. So you'll probably not find very large agricultural farms using drip irrigation. But if you have maybe more local farms or you have one of your own, drip irrigation is probably your best bet. This is where you build a series of pipes and hoses, and the water actually drips directly onto the crop. So this can avoid things like waterlogging, and it can help to conserve any water. All right, everyone, that is it for our video on topic 5.5, which was irrigation methods. Please make sure at the end of the video that you leave a question.